Hi, welcome to part 3. In this part, we are focusing on how do you interpret progress monitoring scores. So you just learned how to administer and score and graph all this progress monitoring data. So this part is like, what do I do with that? Well, let's focus on that. So in this part, you're going to learn about how to graph progress monitoring scores, how to interpret the progress monitoring scores and the graphs, and how we can use that assessment data to make decisions within a DBI framework. So where are we? I think I've asked this question quite a few times. I'm still in Connecticut. You're still wherever you are. But within our DBI diagram, now we're really focusing on these parts right here. I'll go ahead and put my blue arrows in. So we've got our intervention, and we're going to talk a lot about that intervention and that instructional platform in later modules. We already focused on the mathematical content. And we're in the previous parts of this module, we focused on the progress monitoring data. So now we're going to focus on whether we know whether students are responsive or non-responsive. And the same information that determines response and non-response here can be used to determine response and non-response here. Now let's talk about that decision making. So here's a graph for Maria. So Maria's been doing intensive intervention for, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And the question that I want to ask myself about Maria is Maria making adequate progress? Now, I could answer that question by just looking at the data and saying like, well, it looks okay, but we're going to employ some decision rules that will help us make really good decisions about Maria's progress. So we're going to first talk about graphing. So once you've administered and scored those progress monitoring measures, you want to see the data. You want to have a visual presentation of the data. Now, most progress monitoring probes or measures or tests, whatever you want to call them, they will come with scoring programs. Many of these are online. Some of them you do via software, and it'll spit out a graph for you. But you can also graph the scores on your own. So if your school district doesn't have the funds to invest in a scoring program, or if you don't have the time to do that, you can also just do this on your own, and it's quite easy. So that's what we're going to focus on today. But knowing that some of you may just use scores or data reports or graphs that are produced from the progress monitoring company. Now, when I'm thinking about graphing, I always want a graph to look like this. So I want a y-axis that has the range of scores. So here for Maria, the range of scores on the assessment that she's taking go from 0 to 50. And then on my x-axis, I have my weeks of instruction. So this is how many weeks Maria is going to participate in intensive intervention. And I can see that right now I've planned for 16 weeks. So this is what a graph looks like. It's not too fancy. We have our weeks of instruction, and we have our range of scores. Do note with the range of scores that it might be 0 to 100, 0 to 120, 0 to 30. It really just depends upon the progress monitoring measure that you're using. So let's look at your workbook, and I want you to start activity 8A. This activity is going to have 4 parts to it, so you're going to keep coming back to this activity. But I want you to create a graph for a student named Lincoln with the quantity discrimination scores that we've provided. So remember, on your y-axis, you're going to use the range of scores. On your x-axis, I want you to use the weeks of instruction. You can draw this, or you can use some type of graphing program. So you've been working on a graph for Lincoln. Your graph can look a lot of different ways. It might look like this. So here I've actually got Lincoln's scores put in on the graph. You might have a graph that looks like this, where you use the dots to show each of the data points for Lincoln. Or you might have a line graph that looks like this, all right? There's lots of different examples and lots of different ways that you can do this. I want you to find something that's easy for you to interpret. For today, I'm going to use graphs that actually show the data, the scores. So I can assume that Maria scored a 5 in the first week, a 4 in the second week, a 5 in the third week, and so on. That's just going to help me because I'm going to talk about her scores, and it'll help me remember what they are. You might have a slightly different graph, but you just need to have something. So once the scores are graphed, it's really time for me to set some goals. Remember, that question was, is Maria making adequate progress? And from this set of data scores here, I'm not really sure. So I need to set some goals for Maria, and then I'm going to track her progress to meeting those goals. Now, I just said that probably a little bit incorrect. I want you to set a goal for Maria, but there's multiple ways to set those goals. Hey, I made an outfit change, and I'm just popping in to talk a little bit about what you're going to see over the following slides. We're going to talk about 3 ways to set goals within an intensive intervention framework. And usually schools use one of these. And so if your school or if you are really interested in using benchmarks to set goals, you should only pay attention to the benchmark slides, and then you should complete activity 8B. If your school is interested in using national rate of improvement data or slope data to set student goals, you should pay attention to those slides, and then you should only do activity 8C. But then if you are interested in using the intra-individual framework to set goals, so that's using a student's own data to make goals for that student, then you should look at those slides and only pay attention to 8D. Now, personally, I think that all of these things are important. So if this is your first time thinking about goal setting, I think it's totally cool to watch the rest of this part and go through the benchmark stuff and the slope things and the intra-individual framework. But if your school or if you have already decided, like Sarah, I am only going to pay attention to the slope slides, that's totally fine. But then do remember to complete the activity for the slope, for the benchmark, or for the intra-individual framework. So let's focus on using a benchmark to set a goal. This is really the easiest way to set goals for students because there's 3 steps that you need to do in order to set a goal using a benchmark. First, you identify a grade level benchmark. Then you mark that benchmark on a graph and you draw in a goal line from baseline scores to that X or that goal. Now, benchmarks are always provided by the progress monitoring measures in a manual or online. It'll say, oh, a typical 3rd grade student should be scoring this, okay? So for Maria is a 2nd grade student and she is using computation measures. If I was to pick out the benchmark for her, I would look at a table, pretty similar to this one, and I would see that a benchmark for 2nd graders using computation is 20 digits correct in the time frame. So I take that 20 digits and I'm going to put that on Maria's graph. I'm going to scoot to the side as much as I can here. So remember her benchmark is 20, so I'm going to mark that 20 with an X, and I'm going to mark it at week 16. This is really like my final week of intensive intervention for Maria. And then my 3rd thing is to draw a goal line from the baseline to the progress or to the goal. So you can see my baseline is the first set of scores here for Maria, and then this ends up being drawn to the goal, and this ends up being my goal line. And we're going to come back to this goal line later to see whether or not Maria is on track to meet these goals. So now that I have the goal and I have Maria's goal line, then I can start to answer questions about, is Maria making adequate progress? And we'll get to that in just a little while. Now I want you to go back to your workbook and look at activity 8B. I want you to look at Lincoln's graph. So you made this graph, and I want you to mark a benchmark for Lincoln using the provided information. So we just talked about benchmarks, where we can use a benchmark to set a goal for a student and then see how well students are on track to meet that goal. But benchmarks aren't our only option. We can also use slope data, or ROI. ROI stands for rate of improvement. Let's see how to do that. If I'm using the slope method for setting a goal, I'm going to locate the slope or the rate of improvement for a student. Now, just like benchmarks, this data should be provided to you from progress monitoring measures. It should say, oh, a typical student grows 25 hundredths per week or 7/10 per week. That slope data is based on national norms, all right? So this is information that's given to you. Then you multiply that rate of improvement or that slope by the number of weeks left in the intervention. You add it to the baseline, and then you mark the goal in the same way that we did the benchmark. Let's look at how this would work for Maria. So here are some slope data, some typical slope data. Remember, it's going to vary from progress monitoring measure to progress monitoring measure, but this information should be provided to you. Now remember, Maria is a second grade student using computation. So the average slope for a second grade student when they are using a computation measure is 3/10. Now mathematically, I want to say 3/10. I may slip to say today and say 0.3. You can see it's the combination of formal math language and informal math language, which we'll talk about in a later module. So I want you to keep this 3/10 in your mind. So 3/10 is the slope for a second grader like Maria. So I located the slope, and now I'm going to multiply that by the number of weeks left in the intervention. I can't remember exactly how many that is, so let's look at Maria's graph. So let's see, Maria has collected with us 6 data points, and this is the number of weeks left in intervention. Let's count how many that is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there are 10 weeks left in the intervention period for Maria. So I'm going to take that 10 and multiply it by the typical slope. So 0.3 or 3/10 times 10 is 3. Now I'm going to add that 3 to the baseline of Maria's progress monitoring scores. Let me show you about calculating baseline. For baseline, I'm going to take the last 3 scores that I gathered for Maria. So in her last 3 scores here were 7, 5, and 8. So I'm going to add 7, 5, and 8 together for a sum of 20. And then I'm going to find the average of those scores. That'll be my baseline score. So 20 divided by 3, because I had 3 scores that I used, 20 divided by 3 is 6 and 7/10. So I take that 6 and 7/10 and I add it to 3. So 3 plus 6 and 7/10 is 9 and 7/10. And this 9 and 7/10 is Maria's goal when we're using the slope method for finding a goal for Maria. So now let's go to Maria's graph. I'll scoot over here to the side as much as I can. 9.7. That would be Maria's goal if we were using the slope data to determine her goal. So I'm going to put 9.7 on my graph, and then I'm going to draw in my goal line. There we go, from the baseline scores to the goal line. And so now, using that data, I'm going to see how well Maria is on track to meet this goal. Now, using the slope to decide the student's goal adds a little bit more variability to what the goal is going to be. With benchmarks, the benchmark for a second grade student using computation is 20, and it's going to be 20 for all students. When we look at this slope, we're going to look at slope data that's been gathered for a normative sample, and then it's going to be added to the student's baseline score. So if I had a higher baseline score, my goal would be higher. So it's not going to be the same for all students. And in fact, if you're working with 4 students in intensive intervention and you're using the slope data to set those goals, you might have different goals for all 4 of those students. So now I want you to go back to Lincoln's graph. Go back to your workbook and look at activity 8C. I want you to now mark Lincoln's goal using the slope or the rate of improvement, and what would that look like on his graph? And now you'll be able to start to compare what does a benchmark goal look like and what does a slope goal look like. All right, so we've been talking about setting goals for students to then see if they're on track to meet those goals. We talked about using the benchmark, and we just did an example where we talked about using a slope. But there's another example that we need to think about, and that's using the intra-individual framework. Now, benchmark data is given to you. It's based on a set of national norms. Here's where the average student at this grade level should be performing. Slope data is also given to you. You're given a slope based on national norms. Here's the average growth that we would expect for students from week to week. But then you add that slope data to the student's baseline. So there is a little bit of variability there from student to student. But the intra-individual framework is not related to national norm data at all. It's based on the student's intra-individual scores, and we're going to use those scores to set a goal for the student based on their own performance. So let's talk about that. So first we're going to identify the student's slope. So this is not on a chart, and I'll show you how we can figure out the student's own slope. We're going to multiply that to try to increase the progress that the student is making. Then we'll figure out how many weeks to the end of the intervention, add it to the baseline score, and then we'll put it on the graph. So you might say, well, Sarah, how do I calculate a student's slope? Well, this is a really easy slope calculation method. This is called the Tukey method. You don't really need to know that name, even though it's kind of fun to know. I want you to remember this. To calculate a slope, you're going to do the third median data point minus the first median data point divided by the number of data points minus 1. So the third median minus the first divided by the number of data points minus 1. Let me show you what that looks like. So here's Maria. I get to use Maria today. You get to practice with Lincoln in your workbook activity. So remember the slope calculation. I put it up here. So first I need to, sorry about that. First I need to figure out the third median data point and the first median data point. So to do that, I'm going to break Maria's data into about 3 equal groups. And so here I've got a first group, a second group, and a third group with her data. Now this second group, once you figure out what's in the second group, you can ignore that data. We're not going to focus on it at all right? But now we're going to take the third median data point minus the first median data point. Now if I have 2 data points, I'm just going to figure out really the average of these 2 data points. If I have 3, I could take the median, which would just be the middle number of 3 scores. But here, the third median data point, if I add 8 plus 5 together and divide by 2, I get 6 and 5/10. And the first median data point, I'd add 4 plus 5 together, divide by 2, and then my answer is 4 and 5/10. So I'm going to do this first part of my slope calculation. Now I'm going to do the third median data point, which is 6 and 5/10, minus the first median data point. So what is that going to look like? 6 and 5/10 minus 4 and 5/10 is 2. And then I divide that by the number of data points minus 1. Now you might say, well, why don't I just divide it by the number of data points, Sarah? Well, I want you to look at Maria's graph. Maria started here, all right? We did a data collection in the first week. And I want you to count with me how many opportunities Maria has had to show growth from one week to the next. Because remember, we're calculating slope. That's all about growth. So let's count. How many times has Maria had the opportunity to show growth? She didn't have an opportunity to show growth to week 1 because we just started week 1. So let's count. She had 1 opportunity to show growth, 2 opportunities to show growth, 3 opportunities to show growth, 4 opportunities to show growth, and 5. So you'll notice that the opportunities for Maria to show growth are related to this, the number of data points minus 1. So we showed that there were 5 opportunities to show growth, and that is the same as the number of data points minus 1. So I go back here. So I did 6 and 5/10 minus 4 and 5/10, ends up with 2. And then I divide that by 5. And when I do 2 divided by 5, I end up with 4/10. So that is Maria's slope. So I can say from week 1, kind of move over here again, from week 1 to week 6, Maria is gaining 4/10 of a digit per week. So, and she kind of goes down, but on average, she's gaining 4/10 of a digit per week. That is Maria's slope. So I've got that slope. It took a little while to figure that out, but once you know that third median data point minus the first divided by the number of data points minus 1, it's very, very easy to calculate students' slope. Don't be intimidated by it, okay? So we've got Maria's slope, 4/10. Now I'm going to multiply that slope by 1 and 5/10. Now you might say, well, why do I need to do this? All right, let's think about Maria. In fact, I'm going to go back here to her graph. Maria is in intensive intervention, and I'm going to assume I have a goal out here for her, okay? Now, Maria is gaining 4/10 of a digit per week. But if Maria is in intensive intervention, she's already performing below grade level in mathematics. So that means that we, in order to get Maria doing really well out here, we need to amp up Maria's growth. So we don't want to just see 4/10 of growth. We want to see a little bit more than that. So when we multiply by 1.5, that means that we want to see about 50% more growth for Maria. So I multiply 4/10 times 1 5/10, and that means that I really want Maria, if I want her to be starting to meet grade level standards, maybe not needing intensive intervention anymore, I would like her growth to be 6/10 per week. So right now she's at 4/10 per week, and by multiplying by 1 5/10, I would like her slope to be 6/10 per week. I'm setting high expectations for Maria and really high expectations for me as her teacher, because that means I've got a lot of work to do. So then I take Maria's slope that I'd like her to have, and I'm going to multiply that by the number of weeks left in intervention. We looked at this before. Remember, we calculated that there were 10 weeks left in the intervention. So 6/10 times 10 is 6. And then I add that 6 to her baseline score. So where is she now? Remember, her baseline right now is 6 7/10. I add where I'd like her to be in 10 weeks. So that would be, I want her to gain 6 points in 10 weeks. I add that to the baseline score for a goal of 12 7/10. And then it's easy. So now I've got my goal here. I'm going to mark it there. So there's my 12 7/10. And I put in my goal line, and then now I'm going to mark Maria's progress and see how well she's on target to meet that goal. Now, don't be intimidated by using the intra-individual framework. I really like using it with students because it's based on where the student is and then setting high expectations for the students. So I want you to practice it now with Lincoln's graph. I want you to mark the goal using an intra-individual framework for Lincoln. All right, nice work on those workbook activities. We just talked about setting goals for students. And remember, we can use a benchmark, we can use a slope, or we can use the student's own slope by using the intra-individual framework. Now, we do this goal setting to then help us understand whether students are responding to the intensive intervention or not. So look at our DBI diagram. We're going to be doing an intervention, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the following modules. We're progress monitoring. We talked about that earlier in this module. And now we're here, where we're determining whether students are responsive to what we're doing in the intervention or whether students are not responsive to what we're doing in the intervention. And I'm going to go ahead and put our arrows in here so you can see, like, this is where I'm really focusing right now, on that response or non-response. Now, to help determine response, I'm going to introduce 2 ways to think about this. You only need to use one of the ways, but these are really kind of the 2 most common ways that teachers make decisions about student data within a DBI framework. And that is using the 4 most recent consecutive scores or using a trend line. So let's go ahead and talk about this one first. So I can make decisions using the 4 most recent consecutive scores. If at least 6 weeks of instruction have occurred, when the 4 most recent consecutive scores fall above the goal line, it's time to increase the goal. This is a great problem to have. So let's look at Maria. All right, so I've got Maria's scores. I've added some scores in here for Maria since you last saw her. Here is Maria's goal, and here is Maria's goal line. Now I want to look at the 4 most recent consecutive scores. So those would be here, 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 and here. Now what do you notice about these 4 most recent scores in location to the goal line? They are above the goal line. So that means it's time to raise Maria's goal. Now this goal here that I set for Maria, I ended up using the slope method this was the inter-individual framework for Maria. So I used the inter-individual framework to set this goal. Now maybe it's time to use the benchmark data to set the goal for Maria. And then I'm going to see how well, once I change that goal, how well Maria is on track to meet the goal. Now I do want to make a little bit of like a side note. When you do change the goal, it's really important to notate that on the graph in some way. Most often I'll draw a vertical line in here and then I'll write up here like goal change so that you can see. I want to still have all of Maria's data, but then I want to know at this point I made a change, and then how did that change impact Maria's scores. Now I can also think about when I'm what happens when those scores fall below the goal line. That's to adapt the intervention, and we'll talk about that in later modules. So let's say Maria's scores look like this. All right, so here are her 4 most recent consecutive scores, and I'm going to go back real quick. So there they are, and they are falling below the goal line, so it's time to make an adaptation. And again, we will talk about that in later modules. And then when Maria's 4 most recent scores fall kind of above and below the goal line, we're just going to continue monitoring the data. So here I can see we've got some scores that are above the goal line, some that are kind of hugging it. They're pretty close. I'm just going to continue monitoring Maria because it looks like she's on track to meet this goal out here, but we're not quite sure. So I would like you to now look at your workbook and do activity number 9. You're going to look at the graphs for some students, and I want you to make decisions based on those graphs. And here you're going to use the 4 most recent consecutive scores. So do you need to raise the goal? Do you need to make an adaptation? Or are you going to continue progress monitoring? So we just talked about how to make decisions about whether students are responsive or non-responsive using the 4 most recent consecutive scores. But we can also use this method here, which is using the student's trend line. So if the trend line is steeper than the goal line, it's time to increase the goal. What does that look like? Let's look at Maria's scores. So here's Maria's set of scores, here's her goal line, and here is Maria's goal. Now the trend line is just a line that represents the trajectory of Maria's data. So here is my trend line. Now when the trend line is steeper, and in this case it is, when it's steeper than the goal line, it's time to raise the goal. Now on the flip side of that, when the trend line is flatter than the goal line, we need to do the adaptation. And I've said this before, and I'll probably say it more. We'll talk about that in later modules. So if this is Maria's data, here is her goal line, here's her goal, and here's her trend line. It is flatter than the goal line, so we need to make an adaptation to Maria's intensive intervention. And then we have the case that when that trend line and the goal line are fairly equal, we'll continue monitoring progress. So if this is Maria's data, here's my goal line, here's my goal, and there's my trend line. Looks pretty on target to meet that goal. So we're going to continue progress monitoring and continue doing the same thing for Maria. We're going to continue there. So now I'd like you to do activity number 10. Look at the graphs for these students. So we've put in the trend line for each of these students. What decisions would you make about the progress of each of these students? Should we raise the goal? Do we need to make an adaptation? Or should we continue as we have been doing? You've been doing a great job with this part of Module 2. Just to review, we need to set goals for students to see whether they're on track to meet those goals. And there's several options that we can use. We can use benchmarks, a slope or the rate of improvement, or the intra-individual framework, which is based on the student's own slope. And once you set those goals, we need to determine whether students are responsive or non-responsive. And there's 2 ways that you can do this. You only need to use one, all right? So choose which works best for you. You can use the 4 most recent consecutive scores. I like that method because it's a little bit easier. It's just a nice visual analysis. But you can also put in the student's trend line and see whether the trend line is steeper, whether it's flatter, or whether it's right on target. So if I'm thinking about this part in our checklist, our whole question was like, well, how do I interpret these progress monitoring scores? Well, you need to set goals, and you can use the benchmark, the slope, or the intra-individual framework. And then you need to make timely decisions about the student's progress using the 4 most recent consecutive scores, or the trend line. Now, those timely decisions should occur about every 6, 8, or 10 weeks. So I want you to think about that, every 6, 8, or 10 weeks. Now, to finish up this part, I would like you to do this discussion board. So I want you to share with your classmates your current structure for making decisions about DBI. So who administers the progress monitoring measures? Who graphs that data? Is it graphed for you? Who does that? Who makes decisions about their response? And when and how are those decisions made?